Stepfather sends teen girl to reform camp. Years later, she returns for revenge. The small Montana town of Havenwood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and snow-capped mountains, it was picturesque, idyllic, and, for 15-year-old Olivia, increasingly suffocating. Her life had become a tense and happy drama since her mother, Sarah, had married Victor 3 years earlier. Victor wasn't outwardly cruel, at least not at first. He was charming, charismatic, the kind of man who could make you feel like the most important person in the room. He'd swept Sarah off her feet, promising her a stable, loving home. Olivia, who had longed for a father figure after her own father had died when she was young, had initially welcomed Victor into their lives. But the charm was a facade. Behind closed doors, Victor was controlling, manipulative, and increasingly possessive of Sarah's attention. He resented Olivia's presence, seeing her as a threat to his control over Sarah. He criticized her constantly, belittled her achievements, and found fault with everything she did. The tension in the house was palpable. Olivia walked on eggshells, constantly trying to avoid triggering Victor's anger. Sarah, blinded by her love for Victor, often sided with him, dismissing Olivia's complaints as teenage rebellion. The situation escalated subtly, insidiously. Victor's control tightened. He started monitoring Olivia's phone calls, reading her texts, and restricting her social life. He made snide comments about her appearance, her friends, her aspiration. Then came the unwanted touches. A hand lingering too long on her shoulder, a hug that felt too tight, a gaze that made her skin crawl. Olivia tried to avoid him, spending as much time as possible out of the house, at school, at the library, anywhere but home. She tried to talk to her mother, to tell her about Victor's behavior, but Sarah refused to believe her. "He's just trying to be a good stepfather, Olivia," she'd say, her voice laced with disappointment. "He cares about you. You're just being difficult." Olivia felt trapped, isolated, and increasingly desperate. She knew that something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know how to escape. She started to withdraw, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, spending hours alone in her room, writing in her journal, pouring out her fears and frustrations. The breaking point came one evening during dinner. Victor had been particularly critical of Olivia, making snide remarks about her grades, her friends, her lack of ambition. Olivia, finally reaching her limit, snapped. "Stop it," she yelled, her voice trembling. "Just stop it. You're always picking on me. You're always making me feel bad about myself." Victor's face turned red with anger. He stood up, towering over Olivia, his eyes blazing. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he roared. "You ungrateful little brat. After all I've done for you and your mother." Sarah looked from Victor to Olivia, her face pale with fear. "Olivia, apologize to Victor," she said, her voice pleading. "No," Olivia shouted. "I won't apologize. He's the one who should apologize. He's. She couldn't bring herself to say the words, to accuse him of the things he'd been doing, the touches, the looks, the constant feeling of being watched. Victor seized the opportunity. "She's out of control, Sarah," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "She's been acting out for months. She's disrespectful, disobedient, and she's lying about me." He turned to Olivia, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating anger. "You need help, Olivia," he said. "You need discipline. You need to learn some respect." Sarah, torn between her love for Victor and her concern for her daughter, looked at Olivia with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Olivia, what's gotten into you?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" Olivia felt a surge of despair. Her own mother didn't believe her. She was alone, trapped, with no one to turn to. "I'm telling the truth, Mom," she pleaded. "Please, you have to believe me." But it was too late. Victor had already planted the seeds of doubt, and Sarah, blinded by her love for him, was unwilling to see the truth. That night, Victor told Sarah about a reform camp he'd heard about, a place deep in the Montana wilderness, where troubled teenagers were sent to learn discipline and respect. He painted a picture of a strict but caring environment, a place where Olivia could get the help she needed. Sarah, desperate to believe him, desperate to find a solution to the escalating conflict, agreed. She didn't want to send her daughter away, but she felt like she had no other choice. Victor had convinced her that it was for Olivia's own good. And so, within a week, Olivia found herself being driven away from Havenwood, away from her home, away from her friends, towards a place she knew, instinctively, was not what it seemed. A place that would become her prison. The drive to the Clearwater Juvenile Reform Camp was long and unsettling. Victor drove, his face set in a grim, determined expression. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Olivia sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her heart filled with a growing sense of dread. The landscape changed gradually, from rolling hills and farmland to dense forests and towering mountains. The road became narrower, bumpier, and more isolated. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. Olivia tried to ask questions, to find out more about the camp, but Victor refused to answer. "You'll see soon enough," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. Sarah remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her face a mask of sorrow and guilt. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, Olivia's fear intensified. She had a bad feeling about this place, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. She looked at her mother, pleading with her eyes, hoping for some sign of reassurance, some indication that this was all a mistake. But Sarah avoided her gaze, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Finally, after hours of driving, they reached a dirt road, barely more than a track, that wound its way through a dense forest. A rusty, hand-painted sign read Clearwater Ranch, private property. Victor turned onto the dirt road, the car bumping and swaying violently. The trees pressed in on either side, casting long, eerie shadows. Olivia felt like she was entering a different world, a world of darkness and danger. They drove for another mile, the road becoming steeper and more treacherous. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a cluster of dilapidated buildings, a large, two-story log cabin, a few smaller shacks, and a barn that looked like it was about to collapse. It wasn't the idyllic, rustic retreat that Victor had described. It was a grim, desolate place, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. It looked more like a prison than a camp. As they got out of the car, Olivia was met by a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and a menacing scowl. He was wearing a camouflage uniform and carrying a large, wooden baton. "You must be Olivia," he said, his voice harsh and unfriendly. "I'm Mr. Cray, the director of this establishment. We've been expecting you." Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. This was not a camp counselor. This was a jailer. Victor stepped forward, handing Mr. Cray a thick envelope. "This is her paperwork," he said, "and the first month's payment." Mr. Cray took the envelope, his eyes fixed on Olivia. He didn't smile, didn't offer any words of welcome or reassurance. He simply nodded, his expression grim. "We'll take care of her," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or compassion. Olivia looked at her mother, pleading with her eyes, begging her to intervene, to stop this madness. But Sarah just stood there, her face pale and drawn, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't meet Olivia's gaze. "Mom, please," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't leave me here." Sarah finally looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and helplessness. She opened her mouth to speak, but Victor cut her off. "She'll be fine, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "This is for her own good. She needs to learn some discipline." He put his arm around Sarah and steered her back towards the car. "Let's go," he said. "They know what they're doing." Olivia watched in horror as her mother, her only lifeline, got back into the car. She wanted to scream, to run after them, to beg them not to leave her. But she was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Mr. Cray grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "Come on, girl," he said. "No time for tears. We have rules here, and you'll learn them quickly." He dragged her towards the main building, her feet stumbling on the uneven ground. She looked back one last time, hoping to see her mother running back to her, telling her it was all a mistake. But the car was already driving away, disappearing down the dirt road, leaving Olivia alone in the heart of darkness. She was abandoned, betrayed, and utterly terrified. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had just taken a horrifying turn. This wasn't a reform camp. It was a prison, and she had no idea how she would survive. Clearwater Reform Camp was a nightmare made real. The idyllic name and the brochures Victor had shown Sarah were a cruel deception. It was a place of brutality, deprivation, and despair, hidden deep in the Montana wilderness, far from prying eyes. The days were filled with grueling physical labor. Olivia and the other children, ranging in age from 10 to 17, were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, clearing brush, hauling logs, digging ditches, and performing other backbreaking tasks. They were given meager rations of food, often spoiled or infested with insects, and they slept on thin, filthy mattresses in overcrowded and heated shacks. Mr. Cray and his staff, a group of sadistic and merciless men, ruled the camp with an iron fist. They used intimidation, threats, and physical violence to maintain control. They beat the children for the slightest infraction, real or imagined. They screamed at them, belittled them, and stripped them of their dignity. Olivia quickly learned the rules of survival. Keep your head down. Don't talk back. Don't draw attention to yourself. Obey orders, no matter how humiliating or painful. And never, ever, show weakness. But even following the rules wasn't enough to protect her from the constant abuse. She was beaten for dropping a log, for spilling her food, for looking at a guard the wrong way. She was starved, deprived of sleep, and forced to endure endless hours of backbreaking labor in the scorching sun and the freezing cold. The other children were a mix of troubled teens, runaways, and, like Olivia, kids who had been sent there by parents or guardians who either didn't know the truth or didn't care. There was a hardened edge to most of them, a survival instinct that had been honed by years of neglect and abuse. There was Maya, a tough-talking girl with a shaved head and multiple piercings, who had been in and out of foster homes her entire life. There was Ben, a skinny, nervous boy who had run away from an abusive stepfather. And there was Sarah, different from Olivia's mother, a sweet, timid girl who had been sent to Clearwater for disobeying her parents. Olivia, despite her fear, tried to form alliances with the other children. She knew that they were all in this together, that they needed each other to survive. She shared her meager rations, offered words of encouragement, and tried to protect the younger ones from the worst of the abuse. But trust was a dangerous commodity in Clearwater. There were informers among the children, kids who would betray their peers for a few extra scraps of food or a reprieve from the hard labor. Olivia learned to be cautious, to keep her thoughts and feelings to herself, to reveal her true self to no one. The worst punishment, the one that haunted Olivia's nightmares, was the dungeon. It was a small, windowless cellar beneath the main cabin, dark, damp, and infested with rats. Children who were deemed to be particularly rebellious or defiant were locked in the dungeon for days, sometimes weeks, without food or water. Olivia had seen children go into the dungeon and come out broken, their spirits crushed, their minds shattered. She was determined to avoid that fate, at all costs. But she also knew that, sooner or later, her defiance, her refusal to be completely broken, would land her there. She lived in constant fear, her body always tense, her mind always racing, looking for a way out, a way to survive. Despite the pervasive atmosphere of fear and mistrust, Olivia slowly began to form tentative bonds with a few of the other children. Shared suffering, she discovered, could create a powerful connection, even in the most brutal of environments. Maya, the tough-talking girl with the shaved head, initially seemed hostile and unapproachable. But Olivia saw a vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior, a flicker of empathy that suggested a shared understanding. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, Olivia found Maya sitting alone, staring up at the stars. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Olivia said softly, sitting down beside her. Maya didn't answer, didn't even look at her. But after a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My mom used to take me stargazing," she said. Before everything went bad. It was a small opening, a crack in Maya's armor. Over the next few weeks, Olivia and Maya began to talk, sharing their stories, their fears, their dreams. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that transcended the brutality of their surroundings. Ben, the skinny, nervous boy, was another unlikely ally. He was constantly bullied by the other children, picked on for his weakness and his fear. Olivia, remembering her own feelings of isolation, took him under her wing, protecting him from the worst of the abuse and offering him words of encouragement. Ben, in turn, proved to be surprisingly resourceful. He had a knack for finding things, for scavenging scraps of food, for overhearing snippets of conversations between the guards. He became Olivia's eyes and ears, helping her to navigate the treacherous landscape of Clearwater. Sarah, the sweet, timid girl, was the most vulnerable of the group. She was constantly targeted by the guards, who seemed to take pleasure in tormenting her. Olivia felt a fierce protectiveness towards Sarah, shielding her from the worst of the abuse and offering her a shoulder to cry on. Together, the four of them formed a fragile alliance, a secret society of survivors. They shared their food, their secrets, their hopes, and their fears. They looked out for each other, offering support and encouragement in a world that seemed designed to break them. But their alliance was constantly tested. The guards were always watching, always looking for any sign of rebellion or defiance. And there were informers among the children, kids who would betray their peers for a few extra privileges. One day, Ben overheard a conversation between two guards about a planned escape attempt by a group of older boys. He rushed to tell Olivia, his eyes wide with fear. "They're going to run tonight," he whispered. "They're going to try to break through the fence." Olivia knew that the escape attempt was doomed to fail. The fence was electrified, and the guards were heavily armed. But she also knew that she couldn't betray the boys, even if it meant risking her own safety. She told Maya and Sarah about the plan, warning them to stay away from the fence that night. They agreed, reluctantly, knowing that any association with the escape attempt would bring severe punishment. That night, the escape attempt unfolded exactly as Olivia had feared. The boys made a run for the fence, but the guards were waiting for them. There were shouts, screams, and the sickening sound of gunfire. The next morning, the camp was in lockdown. The guards were even more brutal than usual, searching the shacks, interrogating the children, looking for any sign of complicity. One of the informers, a boy named Mark, pointed the finger at Olivia, Maya, Ben, and Sarah. He claimed that they had known about the escape plan and had helped the boys prepare. It was a lie, of course, but it was enough. The four of them were dragged before Mr. Cray, who subjected them to a brutal interrogation. They were beaten, starved, and threatened with the dungeon. Olivia, despite the pain and the fear, refused to betray the other boys. She maintained her innocence, insisting that they had nothing to do with the escape attempt. But it was no use. Mr. Cray didn't believe her. He sentenced all four of them to a week in the dungeon. It was the beginning of Olivia's darkest hour. The dungeon was everything Olivia had feared and more. It was a small, cramped space, barely large enough to stand up in. The air was thick with the stench of mold and decay. Rats scurried across the floor, their beady eyes gleaming in the darkness. There was no light, no sound, no human contact. Just the cold, damp stone walls and the gnawing hunger in her belly. Olivia, Maya, Ben, and Sarah were thrown into the dungeon together, left to huddle in the darkness, their bodies aching, their spirits crushed. The first few days were the worst. The hunger was unbearable, the thirst even more so. The darkness was oppressive, the silence deafening. Olivia felt her sanity slipping away, her mind playing tricks on her, conjuring up terrifying images and sounds. She thought of her mother, of her life before Clearwater, of the world outside the camp. She clung to those memories, to the hope that she would one day escape, that she would see her mother again. But as the days dragged on, hope began to fade. She felt herself weakening, her body shutting down, her mind becoming numb. She started to hallucinate, to see things that weren't there, to hear voices whispering in the darkness. Maya, despite her own suffering, tried to keep Olivia's spirits up. She told her stories, sang songs, and reminded her of the world outside, the world they would one day return to. Ben, surprisingly, found a hidden strength in the dungeon. He used his small size to his advantage, squeezing through cracks in the walls, searching for scraps of food or drops of water. He even managed to catch a few rats, which they ate raw, desperate for any sustenance. Sarah, however, was deteriorating rapidly. She had always been the weakest of the group, and the dungeon was pushing her beyond her limits. She cried constantly, begging for her mother, begging for the pain to stop. Olivia, watching Sarah suffer, felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at the injustice of their situation. She knew that she had to do something, that she couldn't just give up. She had to find a way to escape, not just for herself, but for Sarah, for Maya, for Ben, for all the other children trapped in this hellhole. One night, as she lay shivering on the cold stone floor, she heard a faint scratching sound. She listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, closer this time. She realized that it was Ben, digging at the wall with a sharp stone he had found. He had discovered a weak spot in the mortar, a small crack that he was trying to widen. Olivia joined him, using her fingernails and a piece of broken pottery to scrape away at the mortar. They worked in silence, their hands bleeding, their bodies aching, but their determination unwavering. They worked for hours, taking turns, driven by a desperate hope, a primal urge to survive. And then, finally, they broke through. A small hole, just big enough to squeeze through, opened up in the wall. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and the faint sound of crickets chirping. It was a lifeline, a chance to escape, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But it was also a terrifying risk. They didn't know what was on the other side of the wall. They didn't know if they would be caught. They didn't know if they would survive. But they had reached their breaking point. They had nothing left to lose. They decided to take the chance. The escape was a harrowing ordeal. Squeezing through the hole was painful and claustrophobic. On the other side, they found themselves in a narrow and used storage area behind the main cabin. They could hear the guards talking and laughing in the adjacent room. They had to move quickly and silently. Ben, using his knowledge of the camp layout, led them through a maze of corridors and outbuildings, avoiding the guards and the watchful eyes of the informers. They reached the perimeter fence, the electrified wire looming above them, a daunting obstacle. Maya, surprisingly, revealed a hidden talent. She had learned, during her time in various foster homes, how to disable electrical systems. Using a piece of wire she had found, she carefully short-circuited the fence, creating a small gap. They squeezed through the gap, their hearts pounding in their chests, expecting alarms to sound, dogs to bark, guards to appear at any moment. But nothing happened. They were outside the fence. They were free. They ran, stumbling and falling, through the dense forest, not stopping until they were miles away from the camp. They followed a creek, knowing that it would eventually lead them to a road, to civilization. Exhausted, hungry, and terrified, they finally reached a highway, just as the sun was beginning to rise. They flagged down a passing truck driver, a grizzled old man with a kind face, who listened to their story with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He took them to the nearest town, to the police station. Olivia, her voice trembling, recounted their ordeal, describing the abuse, the torture, the horrors of Clearwater. But the police, instead of offering help and support, were skeptical. They listened to her story with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. They questioned her aggressively, suggesting that she was lying, that she was a troubled teenager who had run away from a legitimate reform school. Clearwater Ranch is a respected institution, one officer said. They have a good reputation. We've never had any complaints about them. Olivia felt a surge of despair. She had escaped the physical prison of Clearwater, but she was still trapped, still disbelieved, still facing a wall of indifference and denial. The police contacted Sarah, Olivia's mother, who arrived at the station with Victor. Sarah, instead of embracing her daughter, was furious. She accused Olivia of lying, of running away, of causing trouble. Victor, his face a mask of righteous indignation, supported Sarah's accusations. He claimed that Olivia was a troubled child, that she had a history of lying and stealing, that she had made up the whole story to get attention. The police, swayed by Victor's smooth talking and Sarah's apparent distress, seemed inclined to believe them. They released Olivia back into their custody, with a warning to keep her under control. Olivia was devastated. She had risked everything to escape, to tell the truth, and no one believed her. She was being sent back to the very people who had abused her, the people who had sent her to that hellhole. As Victor and Sarah dragged her out of the police station, Olivia felt a sense of utter hopelessness. She had failed. She was trapped, with no way out. Her fight for freedom had been in vain. She hated her stepfather. As Victor and Sarah drove Olivia back towards Havenwood, the despair she felt was overwhelming. She couldn't believe that her own mother had sided with her abuser, that the police had dismissed her story so easily. She felt utterly alone, betrayed by everyone she had trusted. However, fate, in the form of a rusty old pickup truck and a woman with a determined glint in her eye, intervened. The truck driver who had given Olivia and her friends a ride to the police station, a man named Earl, had been troubled by their story. He couldn't shake the image of their terrified faces, their emaciated bodies, their desperate pleas for help. Earl, a Vietnam veteran with a strong sense of justice and a distrust of authority, had decided to do some investigating on his own. He'd driven to the area near Clearwater Ranch, parked his truck a discreet distance away, and watched. He'd seen enough of the high fence, the armed guards, the frightened faces of the children to convince him that Olivia had been telling the truth. Seeing Victor's car leaving the police station with Olivia, Earl followed them. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't let Olivia go back to that place. When they reached a secluded stretch of road, Earl made his move. He pulled his truck in front of Victor's car, forcing him to stop. He got out of his truck, his withered face set in a grim expression. "Get out of the car, Olivia," Earl said, his voice calm but firm. "You're coming with me." Victor, enraged, jumped out of his car, ready to confront Earl. But Earl, despite his age, was still a formidable presence. He stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Victor, daring him to make a move. "Get out of the car, Olivia," Earl said, his voice calm but firm. "You're coming with me." Victor, enraged, jumped out of his car, ready to confront Earl. But Earl, despite his age, was still a formidable presence. He stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Victor, daring him to make a move. "You stay away from her, old man," Victor snarled. "She's my stepdaughter. This is none of your business." "It's my business when a child is being abused," Earl said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm not letting you take her back to that hellhole." Sarah, seeing the determination in Earl's eyes, finally seemed to snap out of her denial. She looked at Olivia, really looked at her, and saw the fear, the desperation, the truth in her eyes. "Victor, let her go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Please, let her go." Victor glared at Sarah, his face contorted with rage. He opened his mouth to argue, but Earl cut him off. "She's coming with me," Earl repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And if you try to stop me, I'll call the state police, and I'll tell them everything I saw. And believe me, they'll be a lot less inclined to believe you than those local yokels." Victor hesitated, realizing that he was outmatched. He knew that Earl was telling the truth, that he could make things very difficult for him. He reluctantly backed down, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Fine," he said. "Take her. She's nothing but trouble anyway." Olivia, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief, got out of Victor's car and ran to Earl's truck. She climbed into the passenger seat, her body trembling. Earl got back into his truck and drove away, leaving Victor and Sarah standing on the side of the road, their faces a mixture of anger, shame, and disbelief. Earl didn't take Olivia to his home. He knew that Victor would likely come looking for her. Instead, he took her to a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The house belonged to his sister, Margaret, a retired schoolteacher and a longtime advocate for children's rights. Margaret was a kind, compassionate woman with a warm smile and a gentle demeanor. She welcomed Olivia into her home without hesitation, offering her food, clothing, and a safe place to rest. "Don't you worry, child," Margaret said, her voice soothing. "You're safe now. We'll take care of you." For the first time since being sent to Clearwater, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope. She was safe, she was believed, and she was surrounded by people who cared about her. Margaret listened to Olivia's story, her heart breaking with each detail. She assured Olivia that she would help her, that she would do everything in her power to bring Victor and the staff at Clearwater to justice. Margaret contacted a lawyer, a friend of hers who specialized in child abuse cases. She also contacted a support group for survivors of trauma, ranging for Olivia to receive counseling and therapy. Over the next few weeks, Olivia slowly began to heal. She was still haunted by nightmares, still plagued by fear and anxiety, but she was also starting to feel safe, to feel strong, to feel hope. Margaret became a mentor to Olivia, a guiding light in her darkness. She encouraged her to talk about her experiences, to write about them, to express her emotions in healthy ways. She also helped her to develop a plan for the future, a plan that involved exposing the truth about Clearwater and holding her abusers accountable. Olivia knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was no longer alone. She had Margaret, she had Earl, and she had a growing network of support. She had found her strength, her voice, and her determination to fight for justice. Olivia's first priority, with Margaret's guidance, was to document everything she could remember about Clearwater Ranch. They created a detailed timeline of events, from her abduction to her escape. Olivia drew maps of the camp layout, identified staff members and other children, and wrote down every instance of abuse she could recall, no matter how painful. This process was emotionally draining, forcing Olivia to relive the horrors she had endured. But it was also empowering. It gave her a sense of control, a sense of purpose. She was no longer a passive victim, she was an active participant in her own fight for justice. Margaret helped Olivia to organize the information, creating a comprehensive file that included photographs, drawings, written accounts, and contact information for potential witnesses. They also researched the legal definitions of child abuse, human trafficking, and false imprisonment, familiarizing themselves with the laws that had been broken. The next step was to find other victims, other children who had been subjected to the horrors of Clearwater. This was a daunting task. Many of the children had been sent there from other states, making them difficult to track down. And many were likely still traumatized, unwilling or unable to talk about their experiences. Olivia and Margaret started by searching online, using keywords like Clearwater Ranch, reform camp abuse, and Montana child abuse. They scoured online forums, social media groups, and news archives, looking for any mention of the camp or any reports of similar abuses. They found a few leads, a few scattered references to Clearwater, but nothing concrete. It was clear that the camp had operated in secrecy, carefully concealing its true nature from the outside world. Olivia then decided to use her artistic skills to her advantage. She created a series of drawings depicting the camp, the staff, and the various forms of abuse she had witnessed. She posted these drawings online, along with a brief description of her experience and a plea for other victims to come forward. She used a pseudonym, Survivor 17, to protect her identity. She knew that she was taking a risk, that Victor or his associates might see the drawings and try to silence her. But she felt that it was a risk worth taking. The response was slow at first. But then, one day, she received a message. It was from a woman named Jessica, who had been sent to Clearwater Ranch 5 years earlier. Jessica had seen Olivia's drawings, and they had triggered a flood of painful memories. Jessica's story mirrored Olivia's in many ways. She described the same brutal conditions, the same abusive staff, the same feeling of hopelessness and despair. She had escaped from Clearwater, but she had never reported the abuse, fearing that no one would believe her. Olivia and Jessica connected immediately. They shared their stories, their fears, their anger, and their determination to seek justice. They formed a bond, a sisterhood of survivors. Jessica provided Olivia with the names and contact information of several other former Clearwater residents. Olivia reached out to them, one by one, carefully and compassionately, sharing her own story and offering her support. Some were reluctant to talk, still traumatized by their experiences. Others were eager to share their stories, to finally have their voices heard. Slowly but surely, Olivia began to build a network of survivors, a network of witnesses who could corroborate her story and expose the truth about Clearwater Ranch. It was not an easy mission. The process of gathering evidence was slow, painstaking, and often emotionally draining. Olivia and Margaret spent countless hours on the phone, on the computer, and traveling to meet with former Clearwater residents. They listened to their stories, documented their accounts, and collected any physical evidence they could find: letters, photographs, medical records. They faced numerous challenges. Many of the former residents were still struggling with trauma, suffering from PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Some were afraid to speak out, fearing retaliation from the camp staff or from their own families. Others had simply moved on, trying to forget the horrors they had endured. Olivia and Margaret had to be patient, compassionate, and persistent. They had to build trust, to reassure the former residents that they were safe, that they would be believed, that their stories mattered. They also faced legal hurdles. They needed to gather evidence that would be admissible in court, evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of defense attorneys. They worked closely with Margaret's lawyer friend, learning about the legal requirements for proving abuse and conspiracy. The most crucial piece of evidence, they knew, would be a confession from someone inside Clearwater. They needed someone who had witnessed the abuse firsthand, someone who was willing to testify against Mr. Cray and the other staff members. Olivia had an idea, a risky and dangerous plan. She remembered a young guard, a man named David, who had occasionally shown her small acts of kindness. He had sometimes slipped her extra food or warned her about impending punishments. He had seemed different from the other guards, less brutal, less hardened. Olivia believed that David might be their key. She believed that he might be willing to talk, to expose the truth about Clearwater. But reaching out to him was a huge risk. If he was still loyal to Mr. Cray, he could report her to the authorities, and she could be sent back to Clearwater, or worse. After much deliberation, Olivia and Margaret decided to take the chance. They tracked down David's address, using information they had gleaned from the other former residents. They decided that Olivia, accompanied by Margaret, would confront him directly. They drove to David's apartment, a small, rundown building in a working-class neighborhood. Olivia's heart was pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she was also determined. They knocked on the door, and after a long pause, David opened it. He looked surprised to see them, his eyes widening in recognition. "Olivia," he said, his voice hesitant. "What are you doing here?" Olivia took a deep breath. "We need to talk to you, David," she said. "About Clearwater. About what really happened there." David looked nervous, his eyes darting around. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Yes, you do," Olivia said, her voice firm. "You know what happened there. You saw it. You were a part of it." She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking with his. "We need your help, David," she said. "We need you to tell the truth." David hesitated, his internal conflict evident on his face. He looked from Olivia to Margaret, then back to Olivia. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Come in," he said. He led them into his small, sparsely furnished apartment. They sat down at a kitchen table, the air thick with tension. Olivia recounted her story, her voice trembling but clear. She described the abuse, the torture, the constant fear. She described the other children, their suffering, their desperation. David listened in silence, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. As Olivia spoke, tears welled up in his eyes. I couldn't stop it," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I was afraid. They would have hurt me. They would have hurt the kids even more." "I know," Olivia said softly, "but you can stop it now. You can help us bring them to justice." It took hours of conversation, hours of pleading, hours of reassurance. But finally, David agreed to talk. He agreed to testify against Mr. Cray and the other staff members. He agreed to tell the truth about Clearwater. He also revealed that he had secretly recorded some of his conversations with Mr. Cray, conversations in which Mr. Cray had boasted about the abuse and the money he was making from the camp. The recordings were a bombshell. They were irrefutable proof of the crimes that had been committed at Clearwater. They were the key to bringing down the entire operation. Olivia and Margaret left David's apartment, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and triumph. They had done it. They had gathered the evidence they needed. They were one step closer to justice. The decision to become a journalist wasn't a sudden one for Olivia. It grew organically from her experiences, from her desire to expose the truth about Clearwater Ranch, and from her growing awareness of the power of the media to affect change. While gathering evidence and working with Margaret and the lawyer, Olivia had been struck by the indifference, and sometimes outright hostility, she encountered from some local authorities. It was clear that the camp had powerful connections, people who were willing to look the other way, to protect their own interests. She realized that she needed a platform, a way to reach a wider audience, a way to bypass the local power structures and bring the truth to light. Journalism, she realized, could be that platform. She had always been a good writer, even as a child. She had kept a journal throughout her ordeal at Clearwater, documenting her experiences, her feelings, her observations. Writing had been her therapy, her escape, her way of making sense of the chaos. Now, she saw writing as a weapon, a tool for justice. She could use her words to expose the truth, give voice to the voiceless, to hold the powerful accountable. With Margaret's encouragement, Olivia applied to several journalism schools. She was accepted into a prestigious program at the University of Montana, based on her compelling personal essay and her obvious passion for investigative reporting. College was a challenge, but also a liberation. Olivia was surrounded by other students who were passionate about journalism, about uncovering the truth, about making a difference in the world. She learned about ethics, about reporting techniques, about the power and responsibility of the press. She excelled in her classes, earning top grades and impressing her professors with her intelligence, her determination, and her unwavering commitment to justice. She also started writing for the student newspaper, covering local issues and honing her investigative skills. She never forgot about Clearwater Ranch. It remained her driving force, her ultimate goal. She knew that she needed to build her credibility, to gain experience, to establish herself as a respected journalist before she could tackle such a complex and sensitive story. She spent her summers interning at various newspapers and magazines, learning from experienced reporters and editors. She built a network of contacts, sources who could provide her with information and guidance. She also continued to stay in touch with the other Clearwater survivors, offering them support and encouragement, and keeping them updated on her progress. They were her inspiration, her motivation, her constant reminder of why she was doing this. Finally, after 4 years of hard work and dedication, Olivia graduated from college with a degree in journalism. She landed a job at a small but respected newspaper in Missoula, Montana, a town far enough from Havenwood to give her some distance, but close enough to keep an eye on the situation. She started as a general assignment reporter, covering local news, community events, and court cases. But she was always looking for an opportunity to delve deeper, to investigate, to uncover the truth. And she knew that, sooner or later, she would return to Havenwood, to Clearwater Ranch, to the story that had changed her life forever. She was ready. She was prepared. She was a journalist. And she was going to bring down the people who had hurt her and so many others. The timing was strategic. Olivia had been working at the Missoula newspaper for 3 years, building a reputation as a tenacious and ethical reporter. She had cultivated sources within law enforcement, the legal system, and social services. She had also been meticulously gathering information about Clearwater Ranch, monitoring its activities, and staying in contact with the other survivors. She knew that the camp was still operating, still receiving children from unsuspecting parents and guardians. She knew that the abuse was continuing, unchecked and unpunished. She decided that it was time to act. She had the evidence, she had the sources, and she had the platform. She pitched the story to her editor, a seasoned journalist named Mark. A different Mark. This one is an editor who had a reputation for taking on tough, controversial stories. Mark was initially hesitant. He knew that the story was explosive, that it would likely generate a lot of backlash, that it could even put the newspaper at risk. But he also recognized the importance of the story, the potential for it to expose a horrific injustice and protect vulnerable children. He gave Olivia the green light, but he also cautioned her to be meticulous, to double-check every fact, to make sure that her reporting was airtight. He knew that they would be facing powerful adversaries, people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Olivia spent months working on the story, poring over documents, interviewing sources, and crafting a narrative that was both compelling and irrefutable. She wrote with passion, with anger, with a deep sense of personal commitment. She wrote about her own experiences at Clearwater, about the abuse she had endured, about the friends she had made, about the escape that had saved her life. She wrote about the other survivors, their stories of trauma and resilience. She wrote about the systemic failures that had allowed Clearwater to operate for so long, the complicity of local authorities, the indifference of the community. She included the evidence she had gathered, the drawings, the letters, the medical records, the recorded confession from David, the former guard. She also included interviews with experts on child abuse, with lawyers, with social workers, with law enforcement officials. The story was long, detailed, and devastating. It was a meticulously researched and powerfully written expose of a hidden world of abuse and exploitation. When the story was finally published, it hit like a bomb. The headline screamed across the front page, "Torture Camp Inside the Hidden Hell of Clearwater Ranch." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The story went viral, spreading across social media, picked up by national news outlets, and sparking outrage across the country. Readers were horrified by the details of the abuse, by the cruelty of the staff, by the betrayal of the parents and guardians who had sent their children to Clearwater. They were also inspired by Olivia's courage, by her resilience, by her determination to seek justice. The newspaper's website crashed under the weight of the traffic. The phone lines were jammed with calls from readers, from other victims, from concerned citizens. The story had struck a nerve, exposing a dark underbelly of American society that many people had preferred to ignore. But the backlash was also swift and fierce. The owners of Clearwater Ranch, powerful and wealthy individuals with deep connections to the local community, vehemently denied the allegations. They launched a smear campaign against Olivia, accusing her of being a liar, a troublemaker, a disgruntled former resident with a vendetta. They threatened to sue the newspaper, to shut it down, to ruin Olivia's career. They hired private investigators to dig up dirt on her, to intimidate her, to silence her. Olivia found herself under siege, facing a barrage of threats and accusations. But she refused to back down. She knew that she was telling the truth, and she was determined to see justice served. Her editor, Mark, stood by her, providing her with legal support and unwavering encouragement. The newspaper's lawyers were confident that they could defend against any libel lawsuit, as Olivia's reporting was meticulously documented and corroborated. The other Clearwater survivors, emboldened by Olivia's courage, also came forward, sharing their stories with the media and offering their support. They formed a united front, a powerful force for change. The public outcry grew louder, demanding action from the authorities. People organized protests, wrote letters to their elected officials, and donated money to support the survivors. The pressure became too great to ignore. The state attorney general, facing mounting public pressure and a flood of new evidence, finally launched a full-scale investigation into Clearwater Ranch. The investigation into Clearwater Ranch was swift and comprehensive. State police, FBI agents, and Child Protective Services workers descended on the camp, seizing documents, interviewing staff and children, and collecting physical evidence. The scene they encountered was even more horrific than Olivia had described. They found evidence of torture, starvation, and sexual abuse. They discovered hidden rooms, restraints, and a cache of weapons. They found children who were emaciated, traumatized, and terrified. The camp was immediately shut down, and the remaining children were taken into protective custody. They were provided with medical care, counseling, and a safe place to stay. The staff members, including Mr. Cray, were arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, kidnapping, and conspiracy. They were held without bail, pending trial. But the most significant arrest was yet to come. Based on Olivia's testimony, the recorded confession from David, and the overwhelming evidence gathered at Clearwater, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Victor, Olivia's stepfather. He was arrested at his home in Havenwood, in front of Sarah, who finally, belatedly, realized the truth about the man she had married. She was devastated, heartbroken, and filled with guilt for not believing her daughter. Victor was charged with multiple counts of child sexual abuse, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He, too, was held without bail, pending trial. The arrests made national headlines, bringing the story of Clearwater Ranch to an even wider audience. The investigation revealed a vast network of corruption and complicity, involving local officials, law enforcement officers, and even some prominent members of the community. It became clear that Clearwater Ranch had been able to operate for so long because it had powerful protectors. People who had benefited financially from the camp and who had turned a blind eye to the abuse. The investigation also uncovered evidence of human trafficking, suggesting that some of the children had been brought to Clearwater from other states, and even from other countries. The case became a federal matter, with the FBI taking the lead in the investigation. Olivia, watching the events unfold, felt a mixture of emotions. She was relieved that the camp had been shut down, that the perpetrators had been arrested, that the other children were safe. But she was also angry, disgusted, and heartbroken by the scale of the abuse and the corruption that had allowed it to continue for so long. She knew that the legal proceedings would be lengthy and difficult, but she was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that justice was served. She was prepared to testify, to face her abusers, to tell her story to the world. She was no longer a frightened, abandoned child. She was a survivor, a fighter, a journalist, a voice for the voiceless. She had found her strength, her purpose, and her power. The trial of Victor and the Clearwater Ranch staff was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, spectators, and survivors of the camp. The nation watched, riveted by the unfolding drama, horrified by the details of the abuse, and inspired by the courage of the victims. Olivia was the star witness for the prosecution. She took the stand, her heart pounding, her hands trembling, but her voice clear and strong. She recounted her story, from the moment she was sent to Clearwater to the day she escaped, and her relentless pursuit of justice afterward. She described the abuse she had suffered at the hands of Victor, the horrors she had witnessed at the camp, the fear and despair she had felt. She spoke with passion, with conviction, with a quiet dignity that moved everyone in the courtroom. She faced intense cross-examination from the defense attorneys, who tried to discredit her, to paint her as a liar, manipulator, a troubled teenager with a vendetta. But Olivia held her ground. She answered their questions truthfully and directly, refusing to be intimidated or silenced. She presented the evidence she had gathered, the drawings, the letters, the recorded confession, the testimonies of the other survivors. She presented a compelling and irrefutable case against her abusers. The other survivors also testified, sharing their own stories of trauma and resilience. They corroborated Olivia's account, painting a consistent and horrifying picture of life at Clearwater Ranch. The former guard, David, testified against his former colleagues, describing the systematic abuse, the torture, and the cover-up. He expressed remorse for his actions, and he begged for forgiveness. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, medical records, and expert testimony to support the victims' claims. They demonstrated a pattern of abuse, a culture of violence, and a deliberate attempt to conceal the truth. Victor, sitting at the defense table, watched Olivia with a mixture of hatred and fear. He had underestimated her. He had thought he could silence her, that he could control her. But he had failed. He maintained his innocence, claiming that Olivia was lying, that she was seeking revenge for being sent to the camp, but his denials rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The jury deliberated for several days, carefully weighing the evidence and the testimony. Finally, they reached a verdict. Victor was found guilty on all counts. The Clearwater Ranch staff members were also found guilty on multiple charges. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Olivia, sitting beside Margaret and surrounded by the other survivors, burst into tears, tears of relief, tears of joy, tears of vindication. As Victor was being led away in handcuffs, Olivia stood up and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong. It was a moment of triumph, a moment of liberation, a moment of justice. The sentencing hearing was another emotional event. The judge, visibly moved by the testimony he had heard, delivered a scathing condemnation of Victor and the Clearwater Ranch staff. He sentenced them to lengthy prison terms, ensuring that they would never be able to harm another child. Victor received the longest sentence to 25 years to life in prison. He showed no remorse, no regret, only a cold, defiant anger. Sarah, Olivia's mother, was not charged with any crime. She had been a victim of Victor's manipulation, but she had also been complicit in his abuse. She had failed to protect her daughter, and she would have to live with that guilt for the rest of her life. After the trial, Olivia tried to rebuild her relationship with her mother. It was a difficult and painful process. There was a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of hurt to overcome. But slowly, gradually, they began to heal. Sarah apologized to Olivia, expressing her deep remorse and regret. She acknowledged her mistakes, and she begged for forgiveness. Olivia, with the help of her therapist, was able to forgive her mother, understanding that she, too, had been a victim of Victor's manipulation. They began to rebuild their relationship, based on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. Olivia continued her work as a journalist, using her platform to advocate for victims of abuse and to expose corruption and injustice. She became a powerful voice for change, inspiring others to speak out and to fight for their rights. She also worked to support the other Clearwater survivors, helping them to access therapy, legal assistance, and educational opportunities. She created a foundation to provide resources and support for victims of child abuse and human trafficking. The other survivors, inspired by Olivia's courage and determination, also began to heal and rebuild their lives. Some went to college, some started families, some found fulfilling careers. They all carried the scars of their past, but they were no longer defined by them. The closure of Clearwater Ranch and the conviction of its staff sent a powerful message that child abuse would not be tolerated, that perpetrators would be held accountable, and that survivors would be heard. Olivia's journey had been long and arduous, but it had also been transformative. She had faced unimaginable horrors, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever. She had turned her pain into purpose, her trauma into triumph. She had found justice, not just for herself, but for all the children who had suffered at the hands of Victor and the staff at Clearwater Ranch. And she had found healing, not just for herself, but for her mother, and for the community that had been shattered by the revelations of abuse. Years later, Olivia returned to the site of Clearwater Ranch. The buildings were gone, demolished, the land reclaimed by nature. The only reminder of the horrors that had taken place there was a small, stone memorial erected by the survivors. Olivia stood before the memorial, her hand resting on the smooth, cold stone. She closed her eyes, remembering the children she had met there, the friends she had made, the suffering she had endured. She felt a pang of sadness, a lingering ache for the innocence that had been stolen from her and from so many others. But she also felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. She had done everything she could. She had fought for justice, and she had won. She had exposed the truth, and she had helped to bring healing to a wounded community. She had moved on with her life. She was a successful journalist, a loving partner, and a dedicated advocate for children's rights. She had built a life filled with purpose, with meaning, with love. But she would never forget Clearwater Ranch. She would never forget the lessons she had learned there, the strength she had found there, the friends she had made there. It would always be a part of her, a reminder of the darkness that existed in the world, but also a reminder of the power of hope, of resilience, of the human spirit. It will forever change her life.